Hello everyone. Thanks for coming to the channel. So I'm going to do a couple of things today based on last night's meditation, and I'm going to talk a little bit about myself and what I do and what it's like to be me, and hopefully people will kind of get a better feeling of who I am, what I do, and how I view the world. So I'm doing a meditation technique that I developed out of some of the studies I've done on compassion-based meditations. Compassion-based meditations are, to the best of my ability in the meditative state, I try to imagine or sense or feel what it is like to be in the shoes of another person. And sometimes when I fill those shoes, when I go into those shoes, it literally feels like you literally have walked into somebody else's mind, or you're looking out at the world through their lens. And so when you do certain things, you feel completely justified because you're justifying it from the information that you have based on your reality. And so it's really a very cool technique if you ever decide to really work on developing the empathy technique. People sometimes ask, well, how did you turn out the way you turned out? What's your story? Because you're a bit of an odd duck, Whimsy. We get confused. There's so many, you take so many sides. So I think that a lot of what happens with empaths, particularly empaths that do the kind of work I do, is that it's a type of training you enter into, usually against your will at a very young age, in the sense that I find that empaths are people that have been thrust into incredibly traumatic or difficult experiences at a very early time in their life. For example, before the age of 7, I had probably lived in more than a dozen homes, and I had probably lived with 5 or 6 different families by the age of 7. Now, on the one hand, that's kind of sad. Cry me a river. But I was a foster child, and so on the one hand, that's no way to raise a child, to constantly be disrupting your life, and now you find yourself in a new situation with a new family, and you have to be able to adapt and put yourself in the shoes or in the environment in order to survive that you are now expected to live up to. And so this early training allowed me to develop empathy for people who were very different from myself. My mother's Jewish. My father raised us Jewish. So that was the only religion I was personally raised with. But at a very early age, I wound up in foster care, and I got to experience what it was like to be Catholic. I got to experience what it was like to be Baptist. I got to experience what it was like to be a Mexican-American immigrant. I've lived in a family like that. I've lived with people who are Filipino immigrants as an adult. I lived all over the world. I left the United States when I was 18 and backpacked all over Europe and lived in Europe and met all kinds of exciting people. Then I moved to Israel, and I lived in Israel for 7 years, and that's an extremely diverse group of people in a very small area, and everyone had their version of what the truth was. And I liked everybody I met, but they all were very, very different people. So there is this idea, if you look at Stockholm Syndrome, or anybody who has been in an incredibly stressful situation, in Stockholm Syndrome, they say you put a feather in your cap in order to survive. You say, okay, as a child, put into the back of a squad car when you're 7 years old and put into a detention center or a detention area, and then sent to be with complete strangers who say they're evangelical Christians, and you're being raised a bohemian, liberal, progressive, nice Jewish girl. Those kinds of shocking, traumatic experiences also put me in a situation where I had to feel empathy for people who were culturally very different than myself. So I think that very much played a part in my early training. And then my father got custody of me when I was 8 years old, and then I spent the rest of my time growing up liberal, progressive, Portland, Oregon, Reform Synagogue, B'nai B'rith camp every summer. We had a lot of fun. And then my mother became Baal Tshuva. She became ultra-Orthodox, and so I went to live with her. And so, again, I was exposed to a lot of different experiences at a very early age that forced me to have empathy for people whose worldviews are very different than my own. And I think it's a really good training ground for being an empath. So that's my background. It was a hard knock childhood. I'm not going to lie about it. But I do believe these unusual kinds of experiences growing up really can help us be better empaths. In terms of my education, after I was done traveling the world, I came back and got my undergraduate degree in anthropology. And so again, the theme was the same thing, trying to put myself in the situation of somebody's culture or worldview that was very different than my own. And I think that it goes back to my childhood, wanting to just love people, wanting to love and be loved. And I'll be whatever you want me to be, just love me. Is that how the song goes? And that was something that I saw also as an anthropology major, looking at cultures that were different than myself, really trying to put myself in the shoes of somebody else so that I can feel empathy. So what do I need to do so that I can understand you and love you and feel love for you? So I say this to everybody, and I gave this big speech and came out about my own sad upbringing, not because I want anybody to feel sorry for myself, because I assure you I'm an extremely happy adult, but just what kind of training a lot of empaths, through hook or by crook or through accident or whatever the situation is, we find ourselves in these difficult situations or childhoods that ultimately can be something positive if we want to develop empathy. It's also one of the reasons why I'm a huge advocate for victims' rights, why I don't tolerate victim bashing on this channel. I don't like how the media depicts survivors of violent crime, particularly survivors of child abuse, as monsters. I certainly survived all of those things as a child, and I assure people I'm not a monster. I'm simply a person that had some really difficult things happen when they were younger. So that is also why this channel is dedicated to being a safe space for people who have come from difficult childhoods. And it's also one of the reasons why I decided to vote for, personally, these are my own personal experiences and why I chose to vote for who I voted for, which is why I'm voting for Elizabeth Warren in the primary, because I felt a kinship with her. She grew up poor, working class. She knows what it is to be poor. And I felt, as somebody who had that background, she was going to be somebody that I could relate to. All right, so I say all this before I give today's remote, because part of my big challenge as a remote viewer is to try and love or feel empathy for people that I really have a hard time feeling empathy for. And so today I chose Marine Le Pen. Marine Le Pen is part of the National Rally Political Party. She's the president of the National Rally Political Party, or what my people would call soft, polite fascism, right? She did very well in the last elections against Macron. And last night's meditation, I decided to really see if I could feel what it was like to be in the shoes of Marine Le Pen. So I did my nightly meditation, and I really tried to, in the meditative state, imagine her worldview. Her worldview is rather fascinating, as I envisioned it. She believes that France is a country that should remain French. This was something that I felt when I went into the energy. She feels that the first thing she wants to do is to clean up the education system in France. This was interesting to me to observe because this seems to be something similar to what we see happening in the United States, taking over the educational system. So that was an interesting tidbit that I brought back from the meditation, that she wants to be very strict about the education system in France. She wants to get back to strict old-fashioned French education. She wants people to only speak French, to learn French first, France for the French first and foremost. She started to show me images of the French classroom being the old traditional strict French classroom where kids were expected reading, writing, arithmetic, and to learn French history and to learn French values and to learn French culture and the pride of French culture and a desire to preserve the French culture. There was this feeling in the energy that I had of incredible animosity towards the third world, animosity towards people who come from poor countries, who may not have had the same educational opportunities as myself. Real disdain for people of color that are living in the EU. Part of the conversation, she talked about roving criminal. I know nothing about this, so if you're from Europe, fill in the blanks. But it appeared that what she was showing me was the fact that the EU had no control of its borders, and that there were according to her, a network of roving criminal networks. They were running around and they were committing crimes and then slipping out of France and going off to Germany or somewhere else. And because they were not properly controlling the borders, these crime rings would set up shop, do bad things, and then leave and go somewhere else. And so it was making it very difficult to secure France and other countries in Europe because of this open border policy. And she was extremely critical of people from North Africa. She was incredibly critical of the EU. And there was this real drive to strengthen France, strengthen their education system, go back to old-fashioned French values, and a tolerance of other cultures, but that those cultures would have to respect, if you're going to live in France, you have to first and foremost be French. So that it was a real aggressive feeling that we have to preserve the French language, we have to preserve French education, we have to close the borders, and we have to fight to preserve France for the French people. So that was how it felt to go into Marie Le Pen's energy. And she gave me a vision of France as a solid, financially solid, stable country where people were working, people were happy, people were not at war with French culture, etc., etc. And you could kind of see, as I was in her energy, why this vision of France was attractive to her based on her cultural views. Of course, I personally live on a different planet, but it was an interesting experiment in the sense that it allowed me to really see Marine Le Pen's worldview, to better understand it, and also to counter it. That the more we can put ourselves in the shoes of someone who looks out at the world very differently than we do, we can see that in the mind of someone, even the friendly fascist, they really think that they're doing what's best for their country. Well, we all want good education, right? We all want good education and good opportunities for our citizens. We just have a very different vision of how to get there. All right, so that was, people had asked me to look into Europe, so that was the remote I did on Marine Le Pen. The other meditation I did was Sarah Huckabee Sanders again. She came in again last night during the meditation because she was feeling very much like a victim. And it was interesting. I spent even more time in that energy, that she had felt like a victim during the press conferences, that people were attacking her. It was getting more and more and more and more aggressive, and she felt more and more and more up against the wall, and she felt like it was being done deliberately to undermine her. But what was interesting was last night when I went into the meditation, it expanded, and I found myself confronting something that I call White House gremlins. And this was kind of an interesting vision. In this vision, I saw Sarah Huckabee Sanders and other people working inside the White House as being subjected to what could only be described as White House gremlins. And White House gremlins is a problem that's happening, appears to be happening inside the White House, where stuff keeps getting sabotaged. And it appears to be coming from people who don't feel that they have a lot of power. And so they're coming up with creative ways to make life hell for people in the White House. Things will go missing, things will be sabotaged, letters that are supposed to be going out to large groups of people will have typos, or things will be put into them. It's a feeling of little tiny gremlins. And I heard myself saying, as Sarah Huckabee Sanders, because some other problem had come up, I heard myself saying the Democrats are at it again. So what was interesting also is that when I was in the energy of working in the White House, I not only was being confronted by these gremlins that kept stealing things and messing things up and screwing things up so that we couldn't delay. It was this constant sabotaging I felt. But this other aspect to working in the White House was this constant opposition and fighting that the Democrats were doing to block every single thing that we were trying to do. And it's interesting from a karmic perspective, because I know those people that supported Barack Obama. I voted for him twice. We saw the same obstruction. I don't even think it was this bad, but when he was trying to pass laws. And so, energy being what it is, it's kind of interesting to sit back and look at the energy and say action, reaction. They went after Obama. We're going to obstruct everything. McConnell obstructed everything he tried to do in the Senate. Block, 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 block. And now, what's the reaction from the Dems? Sabotage, sabotage, block, block, block. And we're, anybody who sits back and looks at energy is not particularly surprised by this back and forth that's happening. And how do we actually move forward? And I think empathy is the beginning. Empathy and mediation, and really trying to get into the head of somebody, even someone you may find repulsive, or it's hard for me to not be repelled by Marine Le Pen. But if I'm going to be able to be part of mediation and dialogue between myself and people I may not agree with, I have to at least try to the best of my ability to put myself in the shoes of somebody whose worldview is entirely different than my own. So that was last night's remote. I wanted to share it because I thought it was interesting, and I wanted to share a little bit about my upbringing and what I believe contributed to my worldview being the way that it is. All right, thanks for watching, everybody. Tarot with Whimsy and this remote, and we'll talk to you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.